All right. So again, as last time, I'm hoping there will be a lot of questions and that we can do a little bit more exploration on certain topics. This one is a lot more code heavy as far as showing code on the slide deck. If you don't understand a certain part, please ask and I'd be happy to explain it. If I don't get questions, I'm assuming everybody's following along and understands everything, which is probably not always the case. So please do ask. So the topics that we're going to cover in here are PHP's magic methods. We're going to go over polymorphism, collections, and filtering of collections. And then we're going to touch on a couple of different SPL concepts, the iterator, count, and ArrayAccess. We'll look at the listener pattern, and then we'll have a discussion altogether about MVC and what different people think MVC is or how it should be implemented. And then I've got a brief couple of words on loose coupling and high cohesion, which are OO concepts that you should strive for.
Are you going to be giving out this deck when you're done?
I will post it on, I believe it's a Google thing. I think I can embed it, so I'll stick it on the site, as long as that's the case. If not, I'll try and figure out a way that I can get it out of Google and put it on somewhere. To PDF? I'm hoping I can just embed it, and then that would be great. So you can? Okay. So it'll embed it there. I don't know if you guys have been to the site for a while, frontrangephp.org. It's totally different now. It's, instead of a 200 some odd page Joomla site with lots of Viagra and Cialis ads, it is now a 3-page straight up HTML site. And so we now have a presentation posted from 3 years ago, and I plan on adding more as I find them and convert them or work with them. So magic methods, yes? No, it won't be the first presentation on YouTube, but it should be one of the quickest from time it was done to time on YouTube, because we've now got this thanks to Chad, so we should have good audio and video for this. We've had good video on many of the past presentations, but our audio has been horrible. So, with that being said, magic methods. So, if you've done object-oriented programming and you've done a constructor, you've dealt with a magic method. Now, PHP provides a bunch of other ones, I think 14, 15 if you count autoload, and they're all invoked at certain different times. And I'll briefly go over when they're invoked, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So construct is going to be invoked whenever you call new on a class. It's the thing that's going to set up and initialize the values of your object. Destruct is the opposite of that. It's going to be run when the object is about to go out of scope or get deleted and garbage collected. So you can do things like shut down database connections or spit out an error log or a log message or whatever you want. Magic call is going to be called whenever you try and make a method call to something that you don't have access to. Now this could be for a number of reasons, and many of these next ones are this very similar explanation. It's in the scope that you're not in is when they'll be called. So what I mean by that is when you call a method and it either doesn't exist or you don't have access to it, the magic call method's going to be called. So in other words, if you're in a scope where you're outside of an object and you try and call a protected method and you have an underscore underscore call method, underscore underscore call is going to be called. It's also going to be called if you don't have that method at all, okay? So if you call a method from within the class and it doesn't exist, it will be called. But if you call a method that does exist from within the class, magic call will not get called. Does that make sense? So again, like I said, the rest of these up till unset all get called when you're outside of the scope of whatever it is you're trying to do. So call static is the same sort of deal, but it's going to work on static methods. So if you try and make a call to a static method that doesn't exist or you don't have access to it, call static will get called. Get is going to work if you try and get to a variable that you don't have access to from in a read context. If you're trying to set the value to another variable or something like that, then you're going to end up calling magic set. Does this make sense so far? Is set and unset are the same kind of thing. Is set will be called if you try and see if a particular variable is set and you don't have access to it. Unset, same kind of thing when you try and call unset on a variable that you don't have access to. The next ones are a little bit different. Sleep and wake up are paired together. They get called at the time when you're about to serialize or unserialize an object, which is converted into a string format that you can do to store it in a database or pass it over the wire or something like that. You can do things like close down your database connections or get rid of resources and other things that can't be serialized in there. And then wake up is the other side of that. That's when you call unserialize an object, it's going to call wake up so it can re-establish those connections or create the objects that it needs to in order to be fully put back together. The invoke method is pretty awesome. What this one allows you to do is you can actually create an object and then call it like it's a function. So when I did, $bungalow equals new bungalow, I can now do $bungalow and parentheses, and it will call invoke, and it can run something. So this can be pretty powerful. If you think of a function where you would have to pass in a lot of parameters in order to get it to work, you can actually make this into a class, and you can configure the class and do all this stuff, and then pass that class around and allow that class to be called as though it was a function, but it still has access to all of the class and object things.
So is invoke then inside of a class, basically specifications, what it's going to do when you hit the class that way?
It is the actual function that's going to be called if you call an object like it was a function.
Okay.
And we can come back and do an example of that later on if you'd like. Set state, I don't see used very often at all, but it's going to be used if you're using var export. Var export's a function in PHP that will give you back a sort of runnable code example of a particular object. So if you take that output of var export and eval it or run it or save it to a file and run it, you should, in theory, get back to that same state, and set state helps you do that. The clone method is something that gets called when you call clone on an object. So you may have a counter or something, so you want to keep track of how many unique objects or put a serial number that's unique on a particular object or something like that. Even if it's cloned, this gives you that opportunity to do that. The other thing that clone is very useful for is, by default, clone does what's called a shallow copy. So it'll get the primitives, like the scalar types, integers and strings and floats and so on, and those all are their own instance anyway, but if you had another object inside that class that you're referring to, it doesn't go and clone that by default. So if you tell it in the clone method, in the magic clone method, go ahead and clone this object as well, now your new cloned object will have a new cloned object that matches whatever it was that you cloned before. It's kind of a goofy explanation, but does that make sense? All right. And then autoload, and I put that separately because autoload is technically not a magic method, it's a magic function. But and there's better ways to do it than underscore autoload. I would recommend SPL register autoload if you're looking at doing autoloading. But what autoloading is, who's familiar with autoloading? All right, we're definitely going over autoloading at the end of this because autoloading is awesome. Autoloading allows you to, at the moment it needs it, like let's say I say new house and the code doesn't know about house, it will automatically call this autoload function and I can figure out, okay, the class name is house, it's going to be in this directory, require that function or that class rather, that file where it exists just before I need it. So instead of having a bunch of requires and includes at the top of my file, I don't need any of that. I just put my autoloader in place and now I just use whatever class I need. If I don't use it, I don't include it, it never gets called. It's awesome. So we'll go over that at the end. All right, so polymorphism. So this is an example of polymorphism, and I mentioned back with the interfaces that we were going to talk a little bit about polymorphism. So what I've got here is I've got 3 different classes that implement the same interface. They all implement a speaking interface. Now obviously cats and dogs and people speak differently, but we can tell them all to speak, and according to this example, the speaking interface would have a method on it called speak. So I make a new array called stuff, and I pass in a new dog and cat and a distinguished gentleman, and then I loop over them and I tell them all to speak. And I get meow and woof and what, monocle? And it's all good because they implement those interfaces, and so I know that I'm going to have that method there. So polymorphism is when it allows you to use different objects in different contexts without having to know necessarily what kind of an object you're dealing with. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so Dirk had asked for some examples about how to deal with collections of things. And so the next quite a few slides are dealing with collections, and in this case, we're dealing with silverware. And I think silverware works pretty well as far as polymorphism and collections and things go. So let's assume I've got an interface called silverware container, and it's going to have something like add utensil and get utensil. And they look pretty much like this, but you can imagine what the code might be inside. Maybe I'm storing it in an array or something like that. And I can pass in some item of silverware, and it will store it in that collection, right? So my silverware container, I could have perhaps a silverware drawer. I could have that little thing that goes in the dishwasher. I could have you know, a backpack or a sack or something like that. These are all valid silverware containers that I need to be able to add utensils to. So here's, again, the silverware container interface. So all of the things that I'm going to be considering silverware containers would implement this interface, and then I would know for sure that they would have these two methods on them. So I would know I can add a utensil to them, and I can get a utensil from them by passing in a particular filter. And then we'll go ahead and make an interface for silverware as well. So all the silverware's got a couple of different things that are in common. It's going to know whether or not it's clean, and it's going to know what type it is, so we can, you know, use that and be able to tell if we're trying to saw through a steak with a spoon or something like that. All right, so then here's the abstract class. So we've now got common functionality that I can implement as a utensil. Now you see utensil is implementing the silverware interface. So I've got my get type and is clean, and they're defined. And I also went ahead and built the default constructor, but I don't want just a generic utensil. It doesn't, like, here's a utensil. It doesn't make sense, right? I want a fork or a knife or a spoon or something like that. So this would be another example of where you would make something abstract, even though I provided all of the functionality, and you can extend this in a way where you may not need to provide any additional functionality, but I don't want you to just create a utensil. Because what's a utensil? I don't know. It's a thing, but, or a concept. Does everybody understand this code before I go on to the next slide? All right. So now we've got an extension. We've got a fork, right? And I believe I meant to put use it on the utensil as well. So let's pretend I did that. And when I use a fork, it does the stabby stab thing. And once it does that, it's now dirty. So it sets the dirty flag to true, which would mean that when you ask it if it's clean, it would say, no, it's not clean. So now we've got a spoon, and the same thing, except for use it just makes it dirty immediately. We don't have to do any special spoony sorts of things, or we can do it right and use it. But we also provide a lick clean function that makes it go back to clean, right? So there's different functionality that's provided within each of these classes that's different for each one, right? You're not going to probably slice with a spoon, and you're not going to stab with it either. What's that? Probably not, but you might wipe it on your pants. So we've now provided a way to clean that. So basically we've got a fork that once you use it, it's going to be dirty. But we've got a way to clean our forks and our spoons. So there's our example of a couple of different place settings or utensils. So now we're going to put the silverware away. So I'm going to create a new fork and a new knife and a new spoon. But before I do that, I'm going to use the spoon, right, which makes it dirty. But then I'm going to go ahead and add it into the drawer. So now I've got a drawer, and it's got a fork and a knife and a dirty spoon. It might. So let's say we want to know how many utensils are in the drawer, right? If we're talking about a real drawer, this is kind of a pain. It's dump it all out and start counting, but we've got software for that. So if we've got a virtual object-oriented drawer, we can do a number of things. We can add a method called getNumberOfItems, and we can go and say, okay, in that method, we're going to return count of whatever thing we're storing our stuff in, probably an array. Or we can implement this SPL countable, and this is an interface that's provided in the standard PHP library. That's what SPL stands for. This one's easy, and it's pretty awesome. So we take our drawer, and we tell it implements countable, and all we have to do is provide a single method called count. And in there, we're going to go ahead and do the count this items. And what that allows us to do now is we can actually run count on the drawer, and it will tell us how many things are in there. Now, if I hadn't done this, what do you suppose running count on the drawer would give us? Right, it would give us one. We have one drawer, it's one object, right? But by overriding this and making it implement countable, now PHP says, hey, I'm dealing with this object that implements countable, so now I can run something inside of that object because I know it's there because the interface said it's going to be there, and it's going to tell us something different. So in this case, we tell it how many things are in the drawer. Does this make sense? So the next thing, maybe we want to retrieve specific utensils. Now, storing utensils in an array or whatever doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Because, you know, I don't necessarily know that there's a fork at index 2 or a knife at index 1 or whatever else, but let's say we want to do that. So we could do this, and this is the obvious way of, we're going to say get utensil at index, we're passing in an index, and if it's set, if we've got something there, then we're going to return it. Otherwise, we'll return false, okay? So simple enough, right? Or we can use another SPL interface called ArrayAccess. So we tell it our drawer implements ArrayAccess, and ArrayAccess has 4 methods that we have to define. It has offset get, offset set, offset exists, and offset unset. So these provide a way for us to deal with the drawer as though it was an array directly. Instead of calling a method, we can just use square brackets at the end of our drawer object. So these are pretty simple ones. We've got offset exist is pretty much just doing a check to see if it's set, so we don't end up with notices or anything like that. Unset just unsets it. Offset get checks to see if it's there, and if it's there, it returns it. Otherwise, we return false. So pretty much offset get is what we had before with get it at the particular index. And then offset set. Now this one's a little bit tricky, and when I was first learning this, it took me a little bit to figure out. It'll make a little bit more sense on the next screen, but I've got a little bit more code here. So first I'm checking to see if the offset that we pass in is null. And if it is, then I do the special square bracket array append. Is everybody aware of that one? Right here. Yep, we're just going to append the value onto the end of the array. And if we do specify an offset, then we're going to put the thing at that offset. So it could mean that we're replacing a fork with a knife or something with something else, or putting it off, you know, at some arbitrary value when we put that offset in there. So what this allows us to do now is we can retrieve with that first line. So we've got utensil is drawer 2, so whatever was at index 2 is now stored in utensil as well. We can also create a new thing and just stick it in the drawer just with the square brackets. Without doing that array access, we don't have that ability. We would have to make a method like add utensil to drawer or something like that. Any questions on that? Yeah. Called empty? I think PHP 5.5 has something with that. PHP 5.5 now allows you to do arbitrary expressions in empty. That's one of the new features. What's that? Yeah, so you don't have to set something to a variable and then determine if it's empty. You can actually just call empty on false or empty on true or empty on count of whatever or empty on whatever. So I think there would be a way that you'd be able to do what you're looking to do with empty with 5.5. But as far as with anything before that, I'm not aware of any way to do that. All right, so now we want to go and loop over or deal with the utensils in the drawer. So we can use an iterator. An iterator is an actual concept in PHP. It's a concept in object-oriented programming that allows us to loop over things in a specific manner. So there's a couple different ways that we can do that. We can implement the iterator interface, which is another SPL-provided interface. If we do that, there's a bunch of different bits that we have to implement. I think that's current and rewind and a few others. I didn't go down that path for this presentation, But if you look at the PHP.NET docs, you'll see there's quite a few things that you implement for that. Or you can extend one of these, and there's actually probably 20 or 30 different iterators that are provided. There's things like directory iterators, there's all of these, there's append iterators or array iterators. Array iterator makes it very easy to iterate over arrays, funny enough. There's caching ones, there's callback ones where you can pass in a callback and deal with it that way. There's an infinite iterator, which is kind of neat too. So you can go and say, set up a, like an array of the days of the week, and then put it into an infinite iterator, and then tell it, I want 20 of these, and it's going to give you 20 days cycling Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on until you get through 20. So it's pretty neat. It just loops back to the beginning and keeps on going. So the easiest way to do all of this is just extend array iterator. So all that other stuff I had as far as add utensil and all that, I don't have to write any of it if I just extend array iterator. So when I do that, I'm allowed to do this. So I create my new drawer, I add a fork to it, I create a dirty fork, I add the dirty fork to it, I create a new knife and a new spoon, and I put those in the drawer as well. All of that for free just by extending the array iterator. And now I can loop over the stuff in my drawer, just like it's a normal array or a normal anything else. And what I implemented there was a two-string, very similar to what I did with the bungalow and the shack, that describes it. So it goes and figures out, is it dirty or clean, and what type is it? And so this is the output that I would get from the last bit of code.
Would you also be able to figure out then, using this, which index value it is, so you can go retrieve that specific item out of the drawer after you iterate over it?
Yes, I can still, yeah. So if I put in $key double arrow value, I get the key back.
Okay.
Just like I normally would for looping over an array.
So you could find the dirty fork in order to clean it?
Yep, if I knew what index it was, sure. Or if I go and I say loop over this and find the one where it's dirty and then clean it or whatever, we'd have to implement a way to clean forks, because right now we don't have one, but yeah.
Oh, I know, hire developers.
What's that?
Hire developers.
We could do that. We could do that. Some companies do that. So now let's look at another iterator. So another way to loop over this drawer. So let's say I don't care that I've got clean and dirty silverware in the same drawer, but I do want to only get back clean ones because I'm, you know, parents-in-law, whatever, coming over, and I don't want to put them dirty stuff on the table. So I've implemented a filter, and this extends filter iterator, which is another iterator that's provided by PHP. All of the rest of the stuff for iterator has already been built automatically. I believe filter iterator is an extension of array iterator. So I pass in an iterator, and I think that comes on the next slide. The important part of the filter iterator is this accept function. So I get the inner iterator, which is going to be my drawer, which is an iterator itself. And if it's a utensil, then I check to see if it's dirty, or if it's not dirty rather. If it's not dirty, I return true for accept, and if it is dirty, I return false. So what this is essentially going to do is when I'm iterating over it, it's going to say I'm rejecting all of the dirty stuff and only accepting the clean stuff. So even if I come across an array and it's half dirty and half clean, only clean stuff is going to come out of it. So I can create the new filter, pass in the drawer as the iterator from the inside, and then loop over it, and all I get back out is the clean stuff. The dirty stuff was filtered out. So that's pretty neat, and you can build any kind of iterator that you want to that way. The filter ones are pretty cool. You could also go and take and build an iterator that would say iterate and filter over certain types and combine those. So I could make a fork iterator and a clean iterator, combine those together, and now I only get my clean forks out. And all I have to do is loop over that thing. All right, I think I missed a slide when I was doing this. So that was all I had on the filters and the iterators. The next bit is on the listener and observer pattern. So imagine we've got a class here that's going to send some email, and I've only written parts of the class, obviously it's not all there. But when we want to send an email, we're going to pass in the email address, and we're going to validate it, and if it's valid, then we're going to go ahead and send the email, right? But I'm going to allow this thing to be observable, meaning that other things can can jump in or do certain things when certain events happen. And in this case, what I want to have happen is I want to have it something occur on validate, when I call validate. So when I implement SPL subject here, there's 3 functions that I have to define, or 3 methods I have to define. I've got an attach method, a detach method, and a notify method. If I've got all those 3 implemented, I've implemented the interface. And all I'm doing in here for attach is I'm just adding a bunch of observers, whoever decides to attach to this email class, to an array, or in this case it's going to be an SPL object storage, which is another class that's provided by the SPL. And if they say detach, I'm going to detach it. So observers here, yeah, there it is an SPL object storage, which allows me to differentiate one object from another and be able to access it by the object and say, does this object exist in you, or erase a particular object, or whatever I want to do. So then I've got my notify function, and all I do on my notify function is like loop over the observers that have attached. And because the observers back here had to be SPL observer, I know that they have a certain method available, and that method is update. So every single thing I've attached has an update method. Okay? Does everybody know about type hinting? Does anybody not know about type hinting? Everybody knows and doesn't know. Okay, so type hinting is occurring here when I'm putting this class or method, or not method, class or interface before a particular variable. What it does is it makes PHP enforce that whatever is passed in must be of that type. Now it could be an interface or it could be a class, it doesn't matter, but it has to be that, right? So in order for me to actually attach an observer or detach an observer, that thing that I'm passing as the observer, that object, has to implement the SPL observer interface. And PHP enforces that. You will get a fatal error if you pass in something that is not whatever I've specified. So I can type hint in PHP on objects, on interfaces. I can also type hint on arrays, but as of right now, you can't type hint on primitives like scalar, integer, floats, and that sort of thing. All right, so now we've looped over the observers. We update all of them, which is basically saying, hey, observers, I just did something that you're interested or might be interested in. So then we give them a chance to go and do something. So what we can do there is we can say, and this is how it would get called, right? So back in the very beginning of this class, we had this email calls validate. We do our validation. We figure out if it's valid or not. And then we notify, which then loops over all of the observers and tells them, hey, we did a thing. You should go look at it. So here's an example of one of the observers. So we've got an invalid email observer that implements SPL observer, which means it has that update bit. And again, we've got type hinting, and it must be an SPL subject. And then we go and what comes in there when we notified, or when we did the update rather, we pass in this object, the one that we're actually in. So the observer is now going to have a copy of the object, or rather a reference to that object in itself, so it can do things. I'm going the wrong way. So it can do things with that object. So in this case, we check and we say, okay, was the email valid or was it not valid? Then don't send. We're going to tell the class, don't send to invalid emails. So we don't have to have any code inside that says, well, if it's this or that, then don't send or do send or whatever else. We can implement all of that in an observer pattern, have it completely decoupled, basically unrelated mostly, from the class that we're doing, and enhance the capabilities of our email class without having to mess with the email class. So in this case, if it determines that the email validation failed, it's going to tell it, hey, don't send this email. So following through in the send thing, we would presumably go and say, hey, are we enabled to send or not enabled? And if we're not, don't send. Go on to the next one. We can also do another one. So how many people have sent email in their PHP application? And how many people have done a situation where you may be sending a lot of email? Or you may be sending email to customers? Or maybe you've got test data in your non-production database that has real customer emails in it, right? And you, and you want to be sure that you're not actually sending real emails to real customers when you're just testing, right? So there's all sorts of different ways around this. You can go and make it so the mail server can only send to certain domains, so you can get only your test stuff. You can make it so that it automatically changes the email address to your own or your Gmail or something that you can get. But then you've got this path in your code that is different for each time for each environment that you're running this code in. So this way, if I attach a limited domain observer, right? Now imagine that I can configure this and I can say, here's the domains that are allowed to be sent to, and I can put that in that object, and then I attach that object as a listener to my email. The code now says, okay, the email's valid. Everybody that wants to do something before I get a chance to send, go do it now. So in this case, we go and say, okay, if it's a valid email, now we're going to go and check the domain on that email, and if that domain is in our list of allowable domains, we'll allow it to go through. Otherwise, we're going to disable the sending ability. And we've done that outside of our class, outside of our email, but we've given it functionality in a different way. Does that make sense? So here's how you use this thing. We're going to create our email object. We're going to create our invalid email observer and our limited domain observer, and then we attach them to the emailer. And then we tell the email, send its email, right? And if you remember the code from the beginning, is that shut off? Okay. It sounds way different now. All right. So we send our email. It checks to see if it's valid. Remember, validate goes and does a notice, then. Are you sure it is? All right, so notify goes out to all these observers, so it's going to send a message out to invalid email. It's going to call update. Invalid email is going to get a chance to say, if this isn't a valid email address at all, then don't send. And then we're going to go and do limited domain observer and see, is bar.com a domain that we're allowed to send to? And if it's not, then we're going to disable sending. And then it would continue on with its flow and continue to send the email. I think low battery. It's just on. Low battery is on. Yeah. We're nearly done. It might make it. Any questions on observer pattern or listener pattern? It's super powerful and super cool, all the things that you can do with it without having to mess with your main code. If you just give it this ability to say, hey, I'm interested in something you're doing, give me a chance to do something about it, then you can redirect the flow of your program without having to mess with or have your email class or your whatever class know about these other things. So you don't have to implement those. Those are, it's a way to do it that SPL provides. SPL Observer and SPL Subject are ways that it provides, but you can implement this pattern even without those.
The classes that are being observed, do they have to implement anything special?
In this case, they implement SPL Subject. So these are the things that you want to be able to observe, and then the observer is this one, the thing that wants to do something about the thing that it's observing. Again, you can implement this in your own way. You could have it so it passes a particular message, and then your thing can deal with particular messages that it does or doesn't want to deal with. This one doesn't provide that. It just says, okay, pass the whole class back or pass this object off to the update method. In some ways, I found it a little bit limiting in what you can do by using SPL Observer or SPL Subject, but the pattern is solid. The pattern's really good. All right, so the next concept I wanted to talk about a little bit is loose coupling. And this is the idea of minimizing those dependencies, minimizing the number of classes that you have to deal with at once. So in the last example with the email and the observers, the coupling between those was minimal, right? The observers knew about the email class because they had to deal with it. The email class has no idea about all of the different observers we could write, right? We could write any number of observers and not have to change our email class at all. So instead of having the email class go out and say, okay, we need to deal with invalid emails, we need to deal with if the domain is wrong, we need to deal with if it doesn't have an @ sign, we need to deal with if this is that, if our mail server's down. We can attach all of those things as observers. Those things know about the email class. The email class doesn't have to know anything about them because we follow that interface. And we have loose coupling, which makes it easier for us to test. It makes it easier for us to write code. And it generally makes for cleaner code. That leads into a concept called inversion of control or dependency injection. Inversion of control is where, let's say we're building an email class and you had a validator class that you wanted to put inside of it. Rather than having the email class build that validator class and configure it and do all the things and then use it, we build the validator class or classes somewhere else and pass it into the email class in order for it to use it, right? That gives us a lot more power because if we're passing it in, we can build all sorts of things and pass those in, right? So that's an inversion of control. Instead of it finding the things that it needs, you give it the things that it needs, and then you've got a lot more power and a lot more control over what you want to do. Does that make sense? Cool. Another concept, it's an important one, is high cohesion. In classes and in methods and in functions, you want to do one thing and do it well. If you've got a method or a method or a function name and you've got the word and in it, like do this thing and this, you're probably doing something wrong and it probably needs to be split into more than one function. So there's, Wikipedia's got a decent article on cohesion. I'd recommend taking a look at it. I think there's 7 different kinds of cohesion, ranging all the way from coincidental cohesion, which is, hey, this crap happens to be in the same file, so it's cohesive, right? All the way up to functional cohesion, which is everything about these things is meant to do this one, it's for this one purpose. And there's a couple of different levels of that throughout, including communication cohesion, so they can talk to each other, or they're related based on what they're doing, or related based on the order of how you're going to call things. By having a class with low coupling, or loose coupling and high cohesion, you are making it so it's easier for you to build classes that are more powerful, and they can be recombined and rebuilt and reused in different ways. This is a concept, prefer composition over inheritance. So we know in classes, in object-oriented programming, we can inherit or we can extend a class and make another one that gets all the functionality or most of the functionality of its parent class and some of the properties and so on. And that's one way that you can extend the functionality of a class, but it's probably not the best way. So we could go in, again, to our email class and we could say, okay, we've got this email class and it's very basic and it does this it does this sending. And then we say, oh man, we're sending to a bunch of invalid email addresses. We really need to make this thing check for validity, right? Well, we could extend that and make it a valid email sender, and now it does some functionality where it says, okay, use the functionality in there, but first we got to validate, and then we're going to call this other thing and so on. And then, oh, we need this other class, or we need this other functionality, so now we've got to extend our valid email sender so that it can do domain, or valid domain limited email sender or something like that, right? Or we can go and use composition, which is building up our functionality through composing it of different classes, of different objects, and we can have much more powerful ways of getting done what we need to do, and a lot less problems that you would get with inheritance. So now is time for discussion for MVC. Who has heard of MVC? About half. Who uses MVC? Who has no idea at all what MVC is? All right. So MVC is a pattern that is honestly not entirely web happy, but in the web it allows us to organize things in a nice, happy way. It was invented, I believe, in the late 60s, so it's not new at all. But it stands for Model View Controller, and it's a way to separate, in the web at least, a way to separate where particular functionality goes on our web page. right? So I'm sure everybody's built pages where you go and you have an open HTML tag and you do some stuff, and then you open up a PHP tag and you loop and you create a table, and then you close the PHP tag and you put some links in, and sometimes those links have some PHP echoes in them, and then you come down and we make some includes and some functions and all this, right? And you just read it top to bottom, and it all spits out something that hopefully works sometimes, right? I've done it, I'm sure everybody else has. It's pretty much how you learn PHP to start with. What you may have noticed if you're doing that, or if you've moved a little bit beyond that, is if you want to change how something looks, that becomes a pain, right? If I need to go and say, okay, all I need to do is add one more column to this table that I'm looping over with a for each, and it needs to be here. Okay, I think it's on this line. We put another echo in, we go and run it, and oh, I missed a closed TR tag, and now my table row is all shifted over, and everything looks like a stair step or whatever, right? So MVC allows us to separate what the responsibility is of different things. So our view in MVC is responsible for what we're going to display. Typically it's going to be HTML. It might be something like JSON or XML, but it's going to be the actual output or display of whatever it is we're trying to do, right? Our model, on the other hand, is going to be a business object, a thing that we can deal with. It could be a user, it could be a contract or an order or something like that, and it should have the logic, the things about whatever it is that it is, right? It's a domain object. And then our controller is where our request is going to come in, and we're going to handle that request. We're going to say, oh, okay, I see you're coming in, you're asking for this particular bit of functionality, you've passed in this parameter and this parameter and this parameter. We're going to make sure those are valid, and then we're going to go do something with a model. And then we're going to go maybe write it to a database or whatever. So it allows us to put those things in separate areas. So now our views look like HTML. They're very simple to deal with because they're just output. And our models are just business logic. They don't have to worry about how they're going to be displayed. They just worry about doing business logic-y things, right? And then our controller is what ties those together and brings together the model and the view and puts them together and says, okay, you get this information, it goes on the view worries about rendering it and handling the output of that. Now, who kind of follows the model as a database, or model should be the database kind of method of thinking? It's very, very common. It's especially common in like Ruby on Rails. And this is, okay, here's my model, it extends some class that does some database stuff, right? I think that's kind of harmful. And the reason for that is this. So let's say we go down the path of we're dealing with a user, right? And our user has user things. It's got a username, it's got a display name, so we can say, hey, welcome, thanks for signing in, Jim Bob, or whatever, right? And we put that all together, but it also has to save to the database, right? So it's now responsible for saving to the database, and we can go and say, hey, user, go load yourself from the database. And it loads it, and everything's fine, and it seems like there's no problem. What happens if we want to maybe allow a different way to log in, right? Facebook login is pretty popular, GitHub, Twitter, there's OAuth, there's a bunch of different ways to log in. None of those other ways has anything at all to do with a database, right? At least as far as we're concerned. We don't have access to Facebook's database or GitHub's database or any of these other things. We have access to their APIs. We have access to their SOAP calls or their REST calls or whatever it may be. And so we can go and use those, right? But if we've gone down the path of user model means database, well, now we've got to write a bunch of other methods in our user model that deal with other things, right? So we go and make some more functions of connect through Facebook or connect through GitHub or connect through this, right? And our class starts getting bloated and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And every time we want to add a new way to log in, we have to go and bloat it some more. Well, if we take that out and we separate those two things and we say, okay, the model for the user is just the things about the user. The user doesn't care how it authenticates. It doesn't care how we persist the data. It doesn't care how we save it. It could be to a file. It could be to a database. It could be to a web service. It doesn't care. It doesn't know. It doesn't need to know. Then we can write adapters that will read in from a database and populate a user model, or read in from Facebook and populate a user model, or read in from whatever it is that we need to use. Maybe it's not even been invented yet, but we just write that little class, and now all of a sudden our user model still works. We haven't changed it. All of our code that uses user model still works. All we've got to do is make another little connection of This adapter talks to this model and populates it and does the things that it needs to do. So anyway, that's why I think the model as the database is harmful, is because it limits the way that we think and it limits the way that we have to design our code. Any questions on MVC? I was hoping this would be a little more discussion-y, I guess. All right. Questions? Also, I have another joined in thing, so again, if you could rate this one as well, I would very much appreciate it. Any questions on anything we've covered tonight? They will be. They'll be on frontrangephp.org in the presentation section, as soon as I add a plain old HTML page. All right, no questions? Yeah.
What version of PHP implements everything you talked about? Is there a version beyond which you say?
5.3 implements everything I've talked about. Yep. But that being said, 5.5 was released today, which means 5.3 has 1 year left of life before they discontinue any support for it. So if you can get on 5.4 or later, I would recommend it, but 5.3 is totally fine right now. Okay.